and welcome to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies, a podcast where our international fellows discuss the most pressing issues of today that we're all facing and share their exciting research ideas. We hope you enjoy today's talk. Thank you for tuning in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute of Advanced Studies. I'm Professor Ksenia Shmutsina, Director of the IS, and it's really nice to have so many of you in person today in the International House, hiding from this crazy weather of rain, sunshine, and everything else that this March seems to be giving us. And as always in the International House, we're discussing the most exciting things that they're there to discuss. We're here for intellectual conversations, for debates, and also this talk in particular kind of coincides really nicely with Box that is happening. I'm sure for those of you who walked in the International House, have seen all those young people kind of now wearing their medals already. I guess some competitions have finished. And also earlier today, it's been confirmed that Loughborough University is now #1 in the world QS for sport-related subjects. So it's a decade of being the best in the world. And this talk kind of confirms just that. So it's our absolute pleasure to host Amelia as our residential fellow this month. And Amelia is hosted by the School of Sport, Health and Exercise Science. Sam is the main host for Amelia, and I've heard we've had good collaborations and discussions, with other colleagues. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Lovely to see everybody here today. So what I'm going to do today is to provide some information about my visit. So I've been visiting here at Loughborough for the last few weeks. It's been absolutely fantastic, and being able to meet new colleagues and work with my hosts. So we have Lewis James, who's just walked in, Sam Rowland, who's made a special trip in, very much appreciated, and lovely to meet Nate, and Ian Taylor as well. So we've had a really productive time. What I'm going to do today is to provide some more information about my university at Deakin, what we do, a little bit of information about Melbourne and the importance of sport, my research program, then just provide some information about a project that we did recently and the way that we approached it and how we approached different topics, so including female-specific research, challenging environmental conditions, which are really important topics globally and also for Australians, and then just provide some detail about what I've been doing during my visit, and also some information about how we approach our female physiology and performance initiative, following on from last week's fantastic session, and also after having the opportunity to learn more about the Women in Sport Hub here at Loughborough. So as an overview, just to provide some information about where I've come from. So my research and my work has a foundation in high performance sport. I had the opportunity to do my PhD at the Australian Institute of Sport. So if anyone has visited Australia, that's in Canberra. That was a really good experience to work with some excellent supervisors, including Chris Gore, who was head of physiology, Louise Burke, who was head of nutrition, and also Brian Dawson, who's in Western Australia, and also to have the opportunity for my research to be implemented with different programs, including athletics and rowing. Then I worked for Defence as a sports scientist for 3 years. So that was a really good opportunity. I had a sports scientist role, and what we did was we developed performance tests. So just being able to apply some of my knowledge and also the skills in working in an applied environment. And since then I've been at Deakin University. So that's in Melbourne. I'm a senior lecturer and also coordinate the honours students. So it's really interesting in that way, working with students at the very start of their research career, and gives a lot of variety to my role as well. I also work directly with one of our governing bodies for sport, with Australian Athletics, and get a lot of satisfaction in terms of working with athletes and being able to apply some of our research findings where relevant as well. I have some external roles to the university. So I work as part of the team with International Journal of Sport Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. Lewis is a part of that team as well. I've recently joined an ACSM committee, so that's focused on Olympic and Paralympic sport. So that's been incredibly interesting and means that I get to attend meetings at 1 a.m. in the morning sometimes, but it's so interesting. I don't really mind. I'm also part of a quality assurance committee for the AIS. So that really ties into the work that I did when I first started at the Institute of Sport. That was my role. I was looking at quality assurance in the physiology department, and something I've really enjoyed is being a part of a new conference that we have in Australia that I know Natalia just attended a few weeks ago, which is called the Women in Sport Congress. So that's really focused on exactly that topic, different types of sports science, and also works with high profile athletes and coaches to have kind of a multidisciplinary approach to that Congress. So that was held just a few weeks ago. So sad to miss the actual Congress, but worth it to have my visit here. In terms of my research, I started with looking at buffering agents, so focusing on sodium bicarbonate, and I'll provide a little bit of information about that today. But first, I'd just like to give an overview of Melbourne, why it's important to us in terms of sport, how it can relate to our research, and some of the facilities that we have as well. So Melbourne is very sport focused. So one of the first events that we have every year is the Australian Open. So it's always really exciting. Everybody gets involved. It's always very hot. There's often implementations of the restrictions and the guidelines around heat stress. So there's always a lot of interest there. Then we have the Formula One Grand Prix. So that was at the start of this year. So it's a huge range. In that same precinct, so that's around Albert Park, which is not far from the city, we've also got several of our national sporting bodies. So ours are called national sporting organisations or governing bodies. So we have athletics, we have Combat Australia, and we also have our state-based Institute of Sport, so the Victorian Institute of Sport. So that does allow for a good level of collaboration between scientists, practitioners, and the athletes and coaches in those sports as well, in athletics and combat sports. We've also got a lot of the athletes based in Melbourne. And another event that I'm sorry to miss, but again, it's worth it. We've got an international event in athletics. Which is on the weekend. High note. And a big focus for those of us involved in sport is the 2032 Olympic Games coming up in Brisbane, and that was one of the reasons why the Women in Sport Congress was held in Brisbane, to really capture that excitement and the motivation that we have to strive for excellence in science and in the sport itself, because this conference is a collaboration with the Institute of Sport. If you're not aware, this is our mascot, our boxing kangaroo. And I'd also like to introduce you to Roy. This is our son. He's 4.5, and he's quite friendly with the animals. I have had a few questions about the Australian animals and how scary they are. These kangaroos are quite friendly. This is kind of an exaggeration, though. You don't see this. This is a particularly tame kangaroo, but this is the relevance. This is why it's our mascot as well. So what I'd like to do now is just provide kind of an overview of Deakin. So we had our fantastic session last week where we focused on the research that is really specific to female physiology. But like the sports science area here, there is quite a huge range. So we have quite a big focus on physical activity, on health, sport-related research as well. But I just thought I'd explain this, that there are a range of different areas that we focus on in our school. The areas of health and physical activity are a lot larger than our sport research. And there's also a number of academics here at Loughborough who collaborate with researchers at Deakin, particularly with physical activity. So when I met the Dean the other week, she told me that she collaborates with Anna Timperio and Joe Salmon, who are two of our research group leaders. And the main research group in our school is called the Institute for Physical Activity and Nutrition. So The sport focus group is a part of that, so I'm part of both groups as well. And again, we've got quite a broad range of topics. One of those is women in sport. So we recently had a grant that was through some government funding, looking at reasons as to why females may or may not participate in sport and focusing on menstruation, and other areas such as looking at concussion in rugby. So there's a big range of topics, and if any of these seem to resonate with you, I'm more than happy to connect you with different researchers at Deakin. We've got a very active research program and a number of full-time researchers as well in our school. Now, I'd just like to provide an overview of the research we do in my group or our program. So as I said, I started off looking at buffering agents. So that was my PhD area. So I was looking primarily at sodium bicarbonate, different types of ingestion protocols, the impact on high intensity performance, primarily for rowers, and then I was able to implement the findings with other sports like middle distance running events in athletics with our national sporting body, and also looking at the physiological impact, so looking at how the buffering capacity changed as well. One of the things we did was a meta-analysis throughout the PhD, and we had some interesting findings there, and that's helped to inform our research carrying on from that. So one of the findings, for example, was to be able to quantify what we thought the performance benefit could be. Now we know that there are definite limitations to that type of approach, in that we weren't able to be specific to the type of sport or the level of athlete, but it was useful to have a number. So we found that the performance improvement would be about 2%. And we also saw that with different types of buffering agent, that the time course of the physiological impact and also the effect on performance was quite different. So we looked at sodium citrate, which hadn't been investigated very much at that time, and saw that it seemed to operate differently to sodium bicarbonate. And that led us on a path of investigating sodium citrate. So that has informed some of our buffering work, even in recent years as well. What we've looked at more recently are considerations that are relevant to heat exposure. So with regards to sport in Australia, and of course globally, with temperatures getting hotter, major international sporting competitions of all types being held in hotter and hotter conditions, this is really important, and we've looked at it in different ways. So one way is to start to look at hyperhydration, and looking at the previous research as well and how that links. This is one of our most recent publications where we have looked at hyperhydration using different agents, and we looked at sodium bicarbonate. So we looked at, can that improve hydration status compared with more established agents that are used for hyperhydration. So one of the most common is glycerol. And we found that there were a number of similarities in the time course as well. So this was a rested trial because we really wanted to isolate the physiological responses, the hydration measures. We had multiple hydration measures, and they had a similar pattern to what we see here with fluid retention, which we just quantify as the fluid intake with the urine output subtracted, but we had other measures including things like body mass, urine osmolality, and change in plasma volume. And this was done by one of our students. So this is Ben Patrick. So this was actually his honours project. So with our honours program, basically, we have the students finishing their undergrad, and then they have a year where they basically focus on research and learn a lot about the processes and skills. So that's one area. Another has been looking at heat acclimation and a focus on females as well. So this is Monica Kelly. I know that a number of people in the room are familiar with Monica's work. She presented last week online in our session, and she presented one of her experimental studies. But some other work that she did was to do what we call an audit of the literature. So I know that a few people in the room are familiar with this. It's a kind of a newer way of looking at the literature, where you're not doing a formal literature review. You're not trying to synthesize the results. You're more looking at the methodology, looking at where the strengths and weaknesses are, looking at a comparison between males and females. And the idea is basically that you can then have an efficient way of prioritizing female-specific research if it's warranted. So in this case, this is just to show a couple of ways that the research can be investigated when you're using this audit methodology. With Monica's audit, she was focusing on heat acclimation. So the research was all focused on that area, but there have been audits in a number of different areas, such as supplements. There's one focusing on injuries. And what we can see here is one thing that we look at simply is the number of participants. So it requires you to extract detailed data from every paper that's included, but you're looking at different metrics. And one of the findings was that there's only about 5% of all the literature on heat acclimation where there's exclusively female participants. Another thing that we looked at, and which is part of a framework that was developed by Louise Burke's group based in Melbourne, is that you can also look at what they call menstrual control. So looking at, is there control based on the menstrual cycle and or use of contraceptives, and how well has that been done? So we found that when we looked at the 126 studies, it was rather limited. So when you look at the ratings here, we've got gold, silver, bronze, etc. So gold standard corresponds with established frameworks. So Kirsty Elliott's sales work, where you've got measures where you can quantify menstrual cycle using specific measures. Silver and bronze is acknowledging that some work has been done, but you're not able to meet that gold standard. But then there were a lot of studies that were ungraded or unclassified, so basically not providing the information about that type of menstrual control. So what this does is it does allow you to identify what some of those limitations are, helps you to prioritise study design in that area, particularly with something like heat acclimation, where there is evidence that there most likely is going to be a difference between males and females. So this is some of the work that we've done. We've also looked at hyperhydration in the context of hot weather conditions. So this is Will Jardine, who I know that some people in the room also know through meeting at ECSS and other ways, and also current projects that we're doing as part of my visit here. And one study that he did was he looked at hyperhydration with combined sodium and glycerol, so two established hyperhydration agents, looked at how it changed hydration status and also performance. So the performance trial was a simulated half marathon, and it was actually done around the Formula One course that we saw a photo of previously. The reason that we did that is it's a course that's often used by runners in Melbourne because it's very fast and flat. There's not very much traffic, and it allows for relatively standardised conditions in terms of wind as well, because it's a 5K-ish loop. So what he saw, which was quite interesting, is that there was a substantial improvement in hydration measures. So we've just shown, for example, here, fluid retention, so the same measure as we looked at previously with Ben Patrick's work, but no improvement in the performance, in that time trial performance. So there does give us more scope for more work. One factor we think might have contributed to that is that the weather conditions were not as hot as we'd anticipated. So we did need to get this trial completed because we had multiple people doing the testing at the one time. But it was about 24 degrees, which is classified as warm rather than hot. So it does make us think that perhaps there might be a threshold of when hyperhydration can assist with the physiological responses and also the performance outcomes. And finally, just as part of this overview, something that I've done in recent years is to start to collaborate with an implementation scientist. So because I have this foundation in high performance sport, I continue to collaborate with the AIS. There's a strong interest there on making sure that research findings do get to athletes and coaches and the practitioners who are supporting them. And so this was a way for me to learn more about this field of science and to implement research findings systematically and according to the information provided to us by end users. So this was a project that was funded by the AIS. The way that we collected data was to conduct interviews. So we talked to coaches, we talked to athletes, we talked to practitioners, and the question was all around the guidelines that we have for preparing for hot weather conditions. So things like heat acclimation guidelines, what they know about these guidelines, and also what are some of the barriers that might prevent them from following those guidelines. So, for example, if somebody knows about the frequency with which they might need to train in hot weather conditions to do their heat acclimation, what might be something that prevents them from doing so? And we also had a working group. So we worked with two of our national sporting organisations, with Athletics Australia, as it was known then. It's changed its name to Australian Athletics, which is quite different, and Paddle Australia. And so we just had some quite interesting findings. We found that there was a really high level of knowledge about what types of preparation strategies would be beneficial, but there were just other considerations that we perhaps hadn't thought of. So things like the fact that there are a whole range of things that go into preparation for a major championship, and for some people it can be more difficult to prioritise exposure to the heat. And that can also be in terms of things like the need to do altitude training as well, or the priority to travel to an area where altitude training can be done. So for Australian athletes, this can be places in Australia. So we have some areas of low altitude, but a lot of our athletes will also travel to places like Switzerland, France, prior to the Northern Hemisphere athletic season, for example. So I'd now like to share some details of how we conducted a project that helped us to look into some important issues for our research areas, so female-specific research and also challenging environmental conditions. For this project, I will focus on the buffering agents. This was sort of a way that we could look into the literature with these considerations in mind. And I'd just like to share sort of how we approach this particular issue. So this is something that we worked on in collaboration with some people based in Australia. So there are a number of people in Louise Burke's group who have established some recent frameworks. So, for example, Ella Smith a few years ago published a framework which I know a lot of people are familiar with in terms of looking at female athletes. Alana McKay has a very highly cited framework looking at participant classification. So it was really useful and efficient to have input from people who recently developed these frameworks. Brian Saunders as well has done a lot of work in terms of buffering agents. So it was a really nice opportunity to work with people with this different type of expertise, as well as some people who are known to some people in the room as well who were our PhD students at the time as well. So what we did was we were looking at how these different factors can affect how buffering agents work. And the way that we did it was, as a lot of people who work in this area will know, that with different supplements and nutritional interventions, there are typically quite well-established guidelines. And we just first checked all these guidelines and sort of collated them into one area. So for this part of the presentation, I'll focus on sodium bicarbonate, but we also looked at other buffering agents. We looked at sodium citrate and beta-alanine. So we just wanted to check, what had come out recently, what the guidelines said, so that then we could look at the rest of the literature in this context. So sodium bicarbonate, we first just looked at what the evidence said the dose would be. We looked at the timing that it needed to be taken before exercise, so between 1 and 2.5 hours before exercise, and it's been well established that it is most effective for high intensity exercise. So no real surprises there, but it was useful to have all this information in the one place. Then we were thinking about what would be most important for athletes to consider in terms of using buffering agents? And the reason we thought about this is there is a lot of research on, in particular, sodium bicarbonate. So to my knowledge, the first paper was done in 1931. There weren't very many participants. But it's a really interesting article. So there's been quite a large volume of research, but not all of it is specific to athletes, which is true of most areas. And also just recognising that with some of the current considerations, the literature doesn't necessarily address those. So, for example, for female athletes, so recognising that whether or not there's a difference between how males and females respond to sodium bicarbonate use, we know that there's a high prevalence of females using this supplement, so we need to understand how the responses do occur. There are some reasons why there might be a difference in responses to sodium bicarbonate use between males and females. The research hasn't really been done to test this out, but there are differences in terms of muscle mass, muscle fibre type, and potentially metabolism as well. Also, then we considered that we know that when athletes are travelling, so Australian athletes do tend to travel a lot to reach international competitions, they're often using certain nutritional practices. So one of them for some athletes is the use of buffering agents. We also know that there are factors that can influence how well these buffering agents can work, and one of them are the physiological responses that are observed. So, for example, for sodium bicarbonate, it's typically how much the buffering capacity changes, and so we could look at the literature in that way as well. We were also interested in, when the studies are done, how is the result reported and how is it tested? So is it tested in a way that actually reflects what might be done in a real world event? So that's not always the priority for every study. It's not necessarily something that has to be done. It's very important to quantify work in a more controlled way a lot of the time, but this is what we were interested for this particular question. Then in terms of heat exposure, whilst we were aware that athletes are often using buffering agents for some people in hot weather conditions, there's also the potential that the interaction with the buffering agents and the environmental conditions might mean that there could be more of a need for it. So, for example, with acute exposure to heat, there can be more of a reliance on anaerobic glycolysis, and also aware that the use of buffering agents may impact and perhaps improve hydration status. And then we have similar considerations with hypoxic exposure, where there might be more potential to produce lactate, which buffering agents can support. So good reasons to look at the buffering agents in this context. Then what we thought about is the fact that when we look at studies looking at buffering agents, there are moderating factors. So it has been established in several articles that there are factors to do with study design that can impact how well the buffering agents work. So as you'd expect, the supplement dose. So is the supplement dose adequate? Is it taken at the appropriate time? Is the test or the effort consistent with the exercise intensity and duration? So is it high intensity in this case? And also, are we seeing the physiological responses that can elicit and be associated with performance benefit? Then what we wanted to do was to look at some factors that are relevant to specific parts of the study design that might assist with first having a study that we can have confidence in, but also enhancing the extent to which it might be appropriately translated to an athlete. So one of these was, do we have some level of control taking into account the menstrual cycle or use of contraceptives, which might impact performance if that's not controlled? Study design, so for example, the use of things like familiarisation trials and also dietary standardisation, and also if the performance task reflects what is done in a real world task. So here I'll just provide the way that we evaluated the literature in terms of sodium bicarbonate. We did the same for sodium citrate and beta-alanine, which I'm happy to talk about at a different time. but this is just to provide an example. So basically what we were looking at is taking the recommendations that have been established through about 100 years of literature, comparing those to the studies that were included in this particular review, looking at whether they were compliant or not, and then giving them a rating. So the way we gave them a rating was we created a traffic light system for easy interpretation. Basically, red was less than 40%, so 40% of studies compliant with the recommendations. 40 to 80 was yellow or amber, and green was more than 80. So we saw a good level of compliance with the dose. So typically with sodium bicarbonate studies, the dose is quite standard. But one area where we saw some limitation was intensity. So for example, the test not being of a high enough intensity to have a physical demand where a buffering agent could provide some type of benefit. We also looked at these factors that were more specific to the translation of the findings to high performance athletes. So in that way, we were looking at were high performance athletes recruited to be a part of the study so that the findings could be specific to that population. The way that we defined high performance was at least national level or tier 3, according to the framework, whether buffering capacity was improved, and also if there was a performance effect. So you can see that with these studies that were included, the rate of studies that had a performance benefit was quite low, so just over 20%. The rate where they had an improvement in buffering capacity, so the physiological response that you were looking for, is a little bit higher, but still just over a third. So it suggests that there probably are some limitations in the areas that we identified with our traffic light system that could potentially contribute to that. So it did give us a systematic way of looking at potential areas for further research. When we looked at studies with buffering agents, so this again is just sodium bicarbonate in the heat, there is a very, very small number of studies. So that gave us something to look at straight away. Again, we found that those studies, the supplement dose was as recommended, which is quite standard. But things like the supplement being taken often at a time period earlier than would be typically recommended with the recommendations. Part of that, however, was that in some of these studies, the sodium bicarbonate had been used for the purpose of enhancing hydration status rather than buffering. So that provided some level of explanation for that, and also scope for future research. And indeed, that is an area that we have looked at since performing this review as well. When we looked at the factors specific to the study design, so looking at things like standardisation of meals, familiarisation, there were some limitations there as well, with none of the studies having that green rating, or they were all between 40 and 80%. And then when we looked at studies with hypoxia, the study design was more compliant when we compared it with the studies conducted in the heat, with most of the studies, or all of the studies, consistent in terms of dose, duration and intensity. There was also, however, when we combined the studies that were done in heat and hypoxia, saw a relatively low performance effect. So because we'd conducted the analysis in this way, it did give us some specific things where we could make a recommendation about this area, buffering agents, when we're looking at potential application to female athletes, which is just an important topic in terms of our understanding of the prevalence of females who use sodium bicarbonate in particular, some particular areas for recommendation. So things like being able to look at how the effects might change across the menstrual cycle, where possible, recruiting highly trained female athletes, even though we know it's just really, really difficult to do, as is testing in different phases across the menstrual cycle, but just looking out for those particular opportunities. And also things like testing the effect of buffering agents in environments that are a little bit more realistic. So, for example, we found that there were few studies conducted at low altitude. So what I mean by that is the current classification has low altitude as below 2,000 metres in elevation. So in Australia, we have some mountains, but they're all below 2,000 metres. The highest is about 1,800 metres, but then that's similar to somewhere like Font-Romeu in France, or St. Moritz in Switzerland, which are two places where Australians will train. So things like that, looking at how the response might differ in those areas where training camps might be conducted, could be an area for future research as well. The full review also looks at the combination of different buffering agents, which is always a popular topic, looking at different iterations, and I would be happy to share those in more detail. But in the interest of time, this is just a snapshot of a way that we decided to look at the literature in a way that is not one of the normal conventional ways, with either a narrative review or a systematic review or a meta-analysis. And that was partly due to the limited research that had been done, but it did give us a way of looking at specific components of the research. The last thing I'll mention about this particular review is that another thing that we did was develop a framework where we made recommendations for athletes, coaches, and practitioners using buffering agents who were interested in introducing it to their practice in a systematic way. And this is something that I use now with the athletes and coaches that I work with, in collaboration with two practitioners who are employed with our national sporting organisation, with athletics. And it allows us to work in stages, and it's something that we find gives the athletes more confidence that the way that we're working has been trialled, and we move through trials where we start with resting trials before even moving to trialling buffering agents in training, and we have specific measures that we take. So, for example, taking measures of buffering capacity, quantifying training performance, before we even get to the stage of introducing something in the context of a competition. So that was something that was shared as a resource for GSSI, but then it's also been something that we've recently incorporated into the sports supplement framework resources for the AIS. So as I'm sure many people are aware, this resource gives athletes information and coaches and practitioners about the level of evidence that can support the use of specific supplements. And it's also consistent with other resources like the IOC guidelines. And this is something that we've done recently. So in addition to incorporating that framework where we give recommendations as to how you can incorporate evidence-based use of buffering agents, so it does include consideration of things like beta-alanine and sodium citrate, and includes more recently introduced products like the Morton bicarb system. So we do things like we've given a recommended timeline of how to use these different products. So, for example, the newer Morton bicarb system compared with something that most athletes were using prior to that introduction of the new product, so just capsules that are available from a chemist, how the time course and the timeline can change on a competition day, and also things that can help with dosing, so to provide some worked examples so that somebody could work out from their body mass what they would use in terms of both products. And we have resources that are designed more for athletes and those that are designed for their coaches and practitioners who are supporting them. So in producing that framework, it was a nice opportunity to provide some resources to start to translate those findings, and not just the findings from that particular exercise where we were evaluating the use of the supplements in those contexts, but also the body of literature and the updated work as well. Now, finally, in the last bit of time we have left, I would just like to share some information about the IAS program. So as I briefly mentioned at the start, I've had a month-long visit. Fortunately, I've still got just under a week left because I'll be very sad to leave. I've had the most wonderful time. I've had 3 amazing hosts. So with Lewis and Sam and Ian, we talked about the projects that we're working on. So the first project that we started was with Ian. So that was when I visited the university in 2023 as part of a Deakin University visit. And then at the ECSS conference last year, Sam and Lewis and I talked about some additional projects, and then we've added some projects as well. So just to briefly provide an overview, we have a number of projects focused on various topics. So female-specific physiology, environmental physiology, and also some that are specific to buffering agents. We're conducting 2 audits of the literature. So that's that framework that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, and we have 2 different topics. So just this morning we had a meeting about the first one where we're looking at hydration. So Emma, who's in the room, has been working really hard on that for it's been quite a long process. We have meetings basically every Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. UK time. It's 7 p.m. Melbourne time, so everybody's very dedicated. And we're looking at the audit framework, but specific to hydration. We're also working on another project, and this is something that Lewis and I have met about during this visit, where we're working on another audit, and that's a large project where we're expanding the scope. So we're looking at females and males across the lifespan, acute heat exposure, but not just in the context of sport, in occupational contexts as well. So it incorporates a large volume of literature. We also have other projects, as I said, that are specific to buffering agents, and so it's been a really busy time, but it's been fantastic. We've also fit in some other activities. So I've done external PhD viva examinations. We had one last week for Tom Cable. Just after I arrived, I did another one for Arizona State University. We've had 2 visits where we've had researchers come to Loughborough. So we had one with Mark Waldron and Joe Page. So they came a week or 2 ago, and then just yesterday we had Lewis Goff visiting the university, and I did a visit on behalf of Deakin, which was possible because I was in the UK for this visit just on Monday. So it's been just a fantastic opportunity to do a number of different activities. So last week we had a session that was really interesting in terms of understanding the research that's being done here. We had opportunities for our researchers in Melbourne to share some of their work as well. As I mentioned on the day, that is something that was aligned with our Female Physiology and Performance initiative. So just to provide a little bit more detail about that, we're very much focused on that area. As I said last week, it's something that's available to anybody in our school, so the hundreds of people in our school who have that interest, which means we do have people working across a broad range of interests. We have a molecular biologist, we have people working in occupational health, we have people more focused on physiology, and we have people focused on sport-related applied work as well. So far, this initiative, it's only been going for a few years, but already we've had some major grants from the 2 major national funding bodies in Australia. We've had another grant where basically our executive team was successful in winning a grant with other members of the initiative. That was a government-funded grant. And we've also been a part of some really enjoyable activities. So that includes the Women in Sport conference that I mentioned at the start of the year. So in the 2024 iteration that was held in Sydney, and Deakin had its own theme. So that was a really enjoyable and rewarding experience to be a part of. So our theme was the unique physiology of female athletes. And then just recently in Brisbane, we had a number of people from Deakin who were a part of the organising committee, which is always a really rewarding opportunity as well to be able to work with the AIS who coordinate that conference and be able to work on a national level there. As we said last week, Lewis and I will collate contact information for all our speakers, but this is just a reminder of the presenters who we had last week, and we'll provide you with their email addresses as well, so that if there's any research that you found interesting, please follow up with the presenters as well. And finally, as I said, I've had the most wonderful visit. If any of this information makes you interested to visit Australia, we decided last week that Lewis is going to visit Melbourne and do a comparison between the coffee shops and the cricket fields. But we do have a program at Deakin as well. So please get in touch if this interests you. So there is a funded opportunity for prolonged stays if you're interested in visiting Australia. Hopefully I've illustrated some of the sport related factors and all the different sports competitions. But it's a great place to visit as well, and we'd be delighted to host you. So please get in touch if that's something that interests you. And I'm happy to welcome any questions, and thanks everybody for coming along today, online and in person.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of Loughborough University's Institute of Advanced Studies. A quick reminder about how to stay connected. You can find us on Blue Sky, LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can also watch the presentations on YouTube. The podcast is available on all the major platforms. Please download, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you next time.